He thought his life was stable, until he saw his wife disappear into a car with the school's track coach. He didn't confront them. Not yet. He gathered evidence, stayed silent, and then turned their world upside down. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about resilience, and a man who refused to be broken. Ryan Wells felt his pulse thundering in his ears as his feet hit the dimly lit streets of Maplewood, a quiet suburb outside Denver. The cold air bit into his lungs, but he didn't slow down. His eyes remained fixed on the red taillights of a sleek black car that had just driven off with his wife inside. For nearly 2 decades, Ryan had believed in the quiet stability of his marriage. Now, on a Saturday night that should have ended with pizza and a movie, he was chasing down the vehicle that carried Lena, the woman he had once trusted more than anyone. Earlier that evening, he dropped their German shepherd, Bear, off at Mrs. Ellison's house. The elderly woman peered at him through thick lenses, asking if everything was okay. Ryan had forced a smile, murmuring something about a quick errand. Now, propelled by a storm of adrenaline and disbelief, he followed the car from a distance, keeping pace thanks to the years of marathon training he had taken up after turning 40. The car turned off the main road and pulled into a grimy parking lot next to a faded neon sign that flickered the blue lantern. Ryan crouched behind an old station wagon, watching as Lena stepped out of the car. The streetlight overhead cast enough of a glow to illuminate her familiar posture. She laughed and leaned into a man exiting the driver's side. Even in the half-light, Ryan recognized the confident stride of Miles Carter, the recently hired track coach at Ethan's high school. He watched in silence as the pair embraced. There was no doubt about their intentions. Their movements were casual, practiced, far too familiar. Ryan remained hidden, his breath shallow and steady, fighting the storm that churned inside him. The couple made their way to a low-budget roadside inn adjacent to the bar. Once they disappeared inside, Ryan approached the office of the motel, greeted by a familiar face. Behind the counter stood Theo Jameson, a former student who had graduated a few years prior. Ryan leaned in, voice low and urgent. He didn't need to explain everything, just enough. He reminded Theo of the after-school help sessions, the glowing college recommendation. With visible discomfort, Theo eventually handed over a slip of paper and a keycard. Room 203. Ryan stood outside the door moments later, his phone clenched in his hand. Muffled laughter drifted through the thin walls. Swallowing the bile that rose in his throat, he opened the door quietly, stepping into a scene that confirmed his fears. Clothes were scattered carelessly, Lena's purse on the chair, Mila's gym bag by the bed. The soft hum of a TV and the sound of running water in the bathroom filled the room. Ryan took photos in silence. The room, the belongings, the unambiguous signs of betrayal. From the bathroom, Miles's voice floated out, careless and mocking. He joked about how long they'd been sneaking around, how naive Ryan had been. Lena laughed in reply, her voice cruel in its softness. Ryan left as quietly as he had entered, his hands trembling but his mind focused. Back in the motel office, Theo handed him a USB drive with the security footage. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Back home, the house felt colder than usual. Bear's absence only emphasized the emptiness. Ryan poured himself a coffee and began gathering evidence. He combed through months of financial records, flagged suspicious transactions, and organized everything into neat folders. Hours passed. Just as the sky began to shift from deep blue to pale gray, the front door clicked open. Ryan heard the creak of Lena's familiar footsteps trying to move silently. But before she could make it upstairs, Ethan's voice called out from the hallway. He stood holding Ryan's tablet, the damning images on full display. His face was pale, his jaw tight. Ryan stepped into the hallway just in time to see his son confront Lena. His voice low but clear. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic accusations. Just the devastating truth laid bare. Ryan listened as Ethan told his mother to leave. There was no room for her lies in their home anymore. Lena tried to respond, to offer explanations, but Ryan's calm voice cut through the tension. Her belongings were already packed and waiting outside. The message was final. She threatened him, hissed empty warnings about destroying his reputation, but Ryan remained steady. With quiet resolve, he made it clear that if she pushed, every bit of evidence would go public. Lena faltered. She made one last appeal to Ethan, who turned away without a word. A moment later, the front door slammed shut. Ryan wrapped an arm around his son as the boy's composure cracked. No words could undo what had happened, but Ryan offered the one thing he still could: unconditional support. They sat in silence in the kitchen, nursing mugs of coffee neither really wanted. Outside, the sky continued to brighten. "What happens now?" Ethan finally asked. Ryan looked at him, then out the window. "Now we protect ourselves," he said, "and we move forward. Together." Monday morning dawned with a bitter chill, but Ryan Wells was up before the alarm. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, every motion deliberate, masking the turmoil underneath. The bed behind him was empty, and it struck him again that his life had shifted in ways he couldn't have imagined just days ago. He left early, driving the familiar route to Crestview High, where he taught advanced physics. The building looked the same, but to Ryan, everything felt different. He knew today would be the first true test of his composure. In the teacher's lounge, the low murmur of casual Monday conversations filled the air. Ryan grabbed a coffee, ignoring the curious glances from colleagues who had undoubtedly heard rumors. His plan was simple: stay professional, stay quiet, at least until he had reason not to. Then came the moment he had anticipated. Miles Carter sauntered in, his usual smirk plastered across his face, the same arrogant confidence that had once seemed harmless now reeking of cruelty. Miles made a show of noticing Ryan, voice rising just enough to be heard across the room. He offered a mockingly sympathetic comment about rough weekends, adding a sneer thinly veiled as a smile. Ryan met his gaze, unfazed. There was no point in matching his theatrics. Instead, he issued a calm warning, a simple suggestion that Miles should consider his own future more carefully. The jab landed. For the first time, Mila's smile wavered. Trying to reassert dominance, Miles closed the distance, attempting to intimidate with his size and presence. The lounge fell quiet, eyes turning toward the standoff. Ryan, ever the physicist, calmly referenced leverage, a principle that even a small force, when correctly applied, could unseat something much larger. It was a metaphor, but also a reminder. In one controlled movement, he demonstrated the principle physically. Using a technique learned in self-defense, he redirected Miles's aggressive gesture into a harmless but humiliating stumble, landing him on the floor. It wasn't violence. It was precision. Before tension could escalate, Principal Henry Callahan arrived, his voice sharp with authority. Both men were summoned to his office immediately. Inside, Miles ranted, painting himself the victim. Ryan, composed and meticulous, responded with something more powerful than words: evidence. From his briefcase, he produced a USB drive. With Principal Callahan's permission, he showed footage of Miles and Lena entering a motel room, along with digital records and receipts that confirmed the ongoing affair. Miles tried to argue, but the principal had seen enough. Suspension was immediate, pending a full investigation. Ryan was thanked for his discretion and professionalism. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Whispers rippled through the school. Yet the response was not one of scorn, but support. Students and staff approached Ryan with quiet words of encouragement. The respect he had earned over years of dedication now shielded him. Across town, the consequences for Lena were far more isolating. In her once busy real estate office, silence echoed. Calls went unanswered. Clients canceled meetings. Her assistant, Emma, hesitantly explained that concerns had been raised about her conduct. Lena's attempts to salvage her reputation began with a carefully worded social media post. She portrayed herself as a misunderstood woman going through a difficult time, describing Miles as a supportive friend. But the public wasn't buying it. Comments ranged from cold disapproval to outright hostility. Meanwhile, Miles faced his own backlash. His apartment became a prison of unanswered calls and angry texts. His assistant coach distanced himself, and players from the track team began sharing rumors that painted Miles in a far less favorable light. Desperate, he called Lena. She answered, stressed and disheveled, but still clinging to the hope that they could somehow regain control. Miles had a plan, though his voice trembled with desperation. They needed to redirect the narrative, make Ryan look like the villain. His suggestion: accuse Ryan of being emotionally controlling. Claim that Lena had turned to Miles for safety. Lena hesitated. It was a line she hadn't yet crossed. But Miles pressed, reminding her how little she had left to lose. What neither of them realized was that their call wasn't private. Across the street, a private investigator hired by Ryan sat in a parked van, headset on, recording everything. The small device he had planted earlier in Mila's apartment picked up every word. Back at Crestview, Ryan found an unexpected gathering outside his classroom after school. Former students, colleagues, and even a few parents had come to show support. It was a quiet yet powerful moment. One student stepped forward and told Ryan they believed in him. Later that evening, Ryan received a message from Marco Doyle, his private investigator. Got something big. Meet me at your place. Within the hour, Marco was sitting in Ryan's living room with Ethan by his side. Marco played the recording of Miles and Lena's call. Every manipulative word, every cruel twist of the truth, was now securely in Ryan's hands. Ethan's face tightened as he listened. Anger and disbelief mingled, but Ryan reminded him to stay focused. They had the truth, and that would be their strength. The path ahead would be complicated. But with the evidence now in his possession, Ryan knew one thing for certain. Lena and Miles had made a grave mistake, and the reckoning was only just beginning. The days that followed were a blur of quiet tension and meticulous preparation. Ryan Wells knew that the next move had to be strategic. The truth was on his side, but truth alone wouldn't shield him or his son from the damage that Lena and Miles might still try to inflict. Ethan stayed close, more serious than any teenager should be. The boy buried himself in schoolwork and extracurriculars, perhaps trying to reclaim some normalcy. But his eyes told a different story, a blend of betrayal, resilience, and quiet rage. Ryan did what he could to support him, even if their conversations were often silent. At Crestview High, life moved on. Students prepared for the state science fair, and Ryan, determined not to let personal drama affect their work, poured himself into mentoring his team. The project, a sustainable model for smart urban energy, had taken months of work. His students were proud, and Ryan, in spite of everything, allowed himself to believe in the promise of success. Late one Friday evening, Ryan stayed behind to secure the lab. The others had left hours earlier, and the quiet hum of the school's aging HVAC system was the only sound. As he checked the models, something felt wrong. Upon closer inspection, his heart sank. The centerpiece of their project, a complex electrical model wired to simulate energy distribution, had been tampered with. Wires were cut cleanly, the main processor damaged. Not an accident. This was deliberate. He wanted to call the police, but hesitated. A formal investigation would mean delays, red tape, and possibly disqualification from the competition. His students didn't deserve that, not after everything they had built. Instead, he made a quiet call to Marco Doyle. By the next evening, discreet surveillance equipment had been installed. Hidden cameras captured every inch of the lab. Ryan trusted few people, but one of his top students, Sierra Nguyen, was an exception. He confided in her, and she agreed to help monitor the feeds. The trap was set. 2 nights later, their patience paid off. Just past midnight, a shadow slipped through the lab door. Ryan and Sierra watched silently from the janitor's closet, eyes glued to the tablet displaying the live feeds. The figure moved with confidence. Not a student. As the camera shifted, Miles Carter came into full view. Dressed in dark clothing and wearing gloves, he approached the partially reconstructed project, a set of wire cutters in hand. Ryan didn't wait. He pushed the door open and stepped into the room. Miles froze, his face a mixture of surprise and anger. "You again?" Ryan didn't respond. From behind him, Marco entered with 2 officers from the local precinct. The confrontation was swift. Miles resisted, but the evidence was overwhelming. The cameras had recorded everything. He was arrested on the spot for trespassing, destruction of property, and attempted sabotage. His protests fell on deaf ears. The following day, news of the incident spread quickly. Students rallied around Ryan, and administrators praised his discretion. Miles's teaching contract was officially terminated, and legal proceedings began. Back at home, Ryan and Ethan resumed their routines, both shaken but resolute. The science team threw themselves into rebuilding the project, and Ryan worked with them late into the evenings. The work was intense, but it was healing. Each setback had become a reason to fight harder. The night before the fair, Ryan walked the lab one final time. The new model was better than the original, more efficient, more elegant. It was a testament to perseverance. "You did this," he told his students, who had gathered to celebrate their progress. "No matter what happens tomorrow, know that this is already a victory." At the fair, the Crestview team presented their model with confidence. Judges asked sharp questions, and the students answered without hesitation. When the winners were announced, Crestview took home not one but 3 awards. It was a triumph. As the students celebrated, Ryan stepped back. He spotted someone in the crowd he hadn't expected to see. Lena, standing quietly near the exit, her eyes locked on Ethan. Their son looked at her once, then turned away. She left without a word. Ryan didn't follow. There was nothing left to say. The courthouse steps were cold beneath Ryan Wells' shoes as he stood beside Ethan. His son's steady presence a silent reassurance in the chaos of reporters, murmurs, and anticipation. The day had come. After weeks of accusations, counterclaims, and mounting pressure, the divorce hearing was finally underway. Inside, Lena and her lawyer sat with forced composure. Her companion, now disgraced and unemployed, kept his head low. Miles Carter no longer exuded the arrogant confidence he once carried. Instead, he looked like a man unraveling at the seams. The hearing began predictably. Lena's attorney painted a picture of emotional control and quiet abuse, citing fabricated messages and carefully edited emails meant to portray Ryan as a manipulative partner. It was theatrical, well-rehearsed, and designed for maximum emotional impact. Ethan gripped Ryan's hand under the table. When it was their turn, Ryan's attorney, Melody Hancock, rose with calm authority. Her tone was steady, her words methodical. She began not by attacking but by laying a foundation of facts. Financial records, timeline inconsistencies, eyewitness statements. One by one, she unraveled the false narrative Lena had tried to construct. The centerpiece of their case came in the form of a recording, captured legally by Ryan's private investigator, featuring Lena and Miles discussing their plan to accuse Ryan falsely. As the audio played, the courtroom was still. Every word cut deeper than the last, each sentence a dagger to the lie Lena had tried to tell. Her face, once poised, turned pale. Even her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. By the time the judge spoke, her tone was firm with disapproval. "I've presided over hundreds of cases," she said, her eyes fixed on Lena, "but rarely have I seen such deliberate manipulation of the truth." She ruled decisively. Ryan was granted full custody of Ethan. The family home remained his. Lena would be responsible for all legal fees. Visitation rights were to be determined at a later date, pending psychological evaluation. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. Ryan shielded Ethan with a protective arm, answering no questions, offering no sound bites. This was not about public spectacle. It was about moving forward. Back home, the house felt lighter. Not joyful, but free of the shadow that had loomed for months. That night, Ethan asked the question they both had been holding. "Is it over now?" Ryan looked at his son, seeing the depth of weariness in his eyes. "The legal part, yes," he said, "but we stay ready, just in case." His instincts were right. Within a week, Lena and Miles appeared on a local talk show, attempting to rewrite the narrative again. She cried on camera, portraying herself as a victim of character assassination. Miles leaned into his role as the wrongly accused educator. Ryan said nothing. He watched the interview in silence, then turned off the television. The next day, he held a private town hall meeting. The community center was filled with students, parents, former clients, and colleagues. Standing before them, Ryan didn't attack. He simply laid out the facts, the timeline, the records, the evidence already accepted in court. He played the recording again, allowing the community to hear Lena and Miles in their own words. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Ryan concluded. "I'm asking for fairness. The truth should matter." The room erupted in applause. The tide had turned completely. In the days that followed, Lena faced an ethics investigation from the state real estate board. Her license was suspended. Miles was served with new charges, including criminal conspiracy and tampering with school property. Ryan and Ethan, meanwhile, focused on rebuilding. They cleared out old belongings, repainted the house, and brought in laughter where silence had once lived. Ryan returned to his role at Crestview with new authority and was promoted to head of the science department. When Ethan's graduation day arrived, Ryan stood at the podium and addressed the auditorium. "Life tests us," he said, "not with gentle nudges but with storms. But storms don't break the strong. They reveal them." As the students cheered, Ryan caught sight of a familiar figure at the back of the hall. Lena. She didn't speak. Their eyes met only briefly before she turned and disappeared into the crowd. Outside, amid the celebration, Ethan stood quietly beside his father. "She wanted to talk to me," he said. Ryan nodded. "You don't have to. Not unless you're ready." Ethan looked away. "I don't think I ever will be." There was no anger in his voice, just truth. That night, at Ethan's graduation party, surrounded by friends and laughter, Ryan raised a glass. "To resilience," he said, meeting his son's eyes, "and to what comes next." Ethan clinked his glass against his father's. "To new beginnings." And for the first time in a long while, the future felt wide open. Summer settled over Crestview with a quiet sense of peace. The chaos of the past months had finally given way to calm, and for Ryan Wells and his son Ethan, life began to feel steady again. There were still remnants of the storm, occasional mentions in local news or whispers in grocery store aisles, but those faded quickly in the face of daily routines and forward momentum. Ryan focused on his work. As the new head of the science department, he spent his days planning curriculum, mentoring staff, and developing new projects for the upcoming academic year. The classroom had always been a place of structure and logic, and in those hours of teaching and problem-solving, Ryan found clarity. At home, he and Ethan developed a rhythm. Dinners on the back porch, weekend hikes in the nearby foothills, and late-night conversations that drifted from college plans to small dreams. They were finally beginning to speak aloud. Their bond had only deepened through adversity, and Ryan took comfort in the trust his son placed in him. Meanwhile, Lena and Miles continued to struggle in the aftermath of their exposure. The ethics investigation into Lena's real estate dealings ended with her license being formally revoked. Her name, once a staple in the local market, was now met with polite avoidance or outright disdain. Miles fared no better. The charges related to the school sabotage led to his conviction for attempted tampering with educational property. And though the sentence was minor, the damage to his reputation was irreversible. No school would touch him, and his brief flirtation with public sympathy had vanished. Desperate, they tried one last tactic. Through a small online publication, they released an article claiming they had been victims of a larger smear campaign. The piece attempted to reframe their affair as a product of emotional desperation, with Ryan once again positioned as a cold, controlling figure. But the community had already made up its mind. The article was met with ridicule. Online commenters pointed out the contradictions, and former clients and students rallied behind Ryan in defense. What Lena and Miles didn't know was that Ryan had anticipated this. With Marco Doyle's help, he'd quietly assembled a comprehensive file of evidence that disproved every false claim they might try to publish. He never used it. He didn't need to. The truth had already done its job. In August, Ethan left for college. The house felt different without him, quieter in a way that wasn't sad, just new. Ryan helped him move into his dorm, setting up shelves and tightening desk bolts. Before he left, Ethan hugged his father tightly. You always had my back, he said. I won't forget that. Ryan smiled, pride and love swelling in his chest. And I always will, no matter what. Driving home alone, Ryan let himself cry for the first time in months. Not from sadness, but from the release of everything he'd carried. He had made it. They both had. That fall, Crestview High won a regional award for academic excellence, thanks in large part to Ryan's leadership. His students thrived. He started a mentorship program for at-risk youth. The school board took notice. In November, he was asked to give a speech at an education conference. Standing before hundreds of educators, Ryan didn't talk about betrayal, or courtrooms, or revenge. He talked about resilience. Every challenge is an equation, he said. It may look impossible at first, but with enough patience and the right tools, you find the solution. And sometimes, in solving it, you discover who you really are. The audience rose in a standing ovation. That night, back in Crestview, Ryan sat on the same porch where so many conversations with Ethan had taken place. The sky above was clear. His phone buzzed, a text from Ethan. Just a photo of his dorm room window, glowing warmly against the night. No words. None were needed. Ryan set the phone down and exhaled. For the first time since everything began, he felt something more than peace. He felt whole. And he knew, without question, that whatever came next, he would face it with strength, integrity, and a heart that had been broken but never destroyed.